Good morning, y'all. I'm Ben, and welcome to Basin Nursery Botanical Boot Camp. Today, we are talking about climate in Middle Tennessee, which I think is definitely appropriate right now. We're going through kind of a fall shuffle going into winter. We've had some ups and downs in our weather, and that's kind of typical of Middle Tennessee climate. So, yeah, we're going to have a few slides today. I've got some plants just to kind of look at plants that grow in our climate and similar plants that don't grow in our climate, and just to show some kind of diversity is what we're talking about. So, yeah, first thing, we're just going to jump into a little short slideshow just to kind of give y'all some information on climate, because a lot of times when we talk about climate, there's numbers and temperatures that we want to look at that really kind of guide us into where we are. So, yeah, we'll shoot into that, and we'll talk about the plants after that, and then take questions at the end. So, and as always, let us know if you want to type out questions. We can try to address them as they come up. All right, so we're going to jump into this slideshow. We are talking about Middle Tennessee climate. Is it pretty much up there?
Hold on a second.
Okay. Well, yeah, we're talking about climate in Middle Tennessee, but we'll also talk about general Tennessee climate. I will, before we jump into that, actually, we found something on the lot today, and we'll just kind of take a little time for a second to look at these praying mantis eggs that we found. So a lot of times when we get our field dug plants, our living Christmas trees as we call them here at Bates, we will get insect eggs that just come from them growing in the ground. And these little praying mantis eggs, now whether they're Asian praying mantises or native praying mantises, it's kind of hard to tell. But these are usually found on the bottom of stems, and I mean, you can see there's still pine needles sticking out of it. Sometimes they'll fall off on the ground, but they kind of look like a little book. They kind of have little stacked look to them. And that's a pretty identifying feature for a praying mantis egg. So if you see these, don't throw them in the garbage. Maybe tuck them in a corner outside your house or put them in a dry location near your garden. We'll probably stick these in our greenhouse, and hopefully here in the next 6 months, we should have a hatch of praying mantises. So just kind of a little side thing there, something we found today. So praying mantis eggs, definitely a beneficial insect. They're non-discriminatory, so they'll eat any insect. But yeah, praying mantis eggs, keep an eye out for them. If you see them on your tree, feel free to leave them on or take them off and put them somewhere where they'll be beneficial to you. Okay, so we're going to jump into our climate talk here. I do have a little picture here as a diversion. This is Wyoming, so I used to live in Jackson Hole, Wyoming for a little bit, which has wild climate patterns. They get tons of snowfall. They also get lots of heat in the summer, and we used to do a lot of hiking up the mountains there. And the elevation in the mountains is 6,000 feet above the basin floor. So in the spring, you can see in that picture the floor of the valley is actually no snow. It's very dry and greenish brown. And then up at the high elevations, there's snow sometimes all year. So just as a little example of how climate, even in a small area, can change, and we'll call those microclimates. So climates up in high elevation versus low elevation. You could look at this like the climates up in the Smoky Mountains versus the climates in around Memphis, West Tennessee. Very different climates because of the geography and the terrain there. So just kind of a little blip there about showing how diverse climate can be with different geography. Okay, so what are we talking about with climate? Most of us are looking at in association with weather, and climate and weather can kind of be synonymous. But climate, we're talking about a specific area, and it can be a lot of different definitions. So we can look at climate across a country, across a region like the Southeast, the Northeast, the Midwest, or states like Tennessee. We can look at the entire climate across the state, or divisions within the state. So working in the Central Basin here in Nashville, and that would be our climate region within Tennessee. And there's a lot of different factors for climate. So we'll look at temperature variance, humidity levels or drought levels, rainfall, and then geography. So what's the terrain doing with that weather? We'll touch on cold and heat hardiness zone maps. That's kind of a factor within climate that really helps us in the landscape. And we'll take a look at those maps, and that'll impact specifically planting outdoors. Okay. General climate across Middle Tennessee, it's fairly consistent with some exceptions, because of the mountains like we talked about. So we have lowlands and plateaus, Memphis versus kind of mid-east Tennessee. We also have basins like we're in, and then we have mountains like Appalachia. So we have a lot of variability, and the precipitation and the freezing temperatures are defined by that difference. Temperature and rainfall can vary pretty greatly. It's mostly rainfall. The temperatures are fairly stable, but we get lots of different rainfall levels, like the Smokies are fairly wet. And it's usually affected by waterways and mountains, typically running north to south, and there's other directions. But, our mountains across Tennessee tend to go north to south, and so weather moving across those mountains can change, and we see little pockets. So that's kind of a general way to see the weather in Tennessee. Overall, we're considered the humid subtropics. So, as opposed, with the exception of Appalachia, most of Tennessee is considered subtropic. The Appalachians are the highland climate as well as the plateau. So we're describing warm, humid summers and then mild, wet winters. And then spring and fall tend to be pretty heavy with rainfall as well. Our cold hardiness goes from 5B to 8A, so quite a large range. 5B would be like high elevation up in the mountains, and 8A would be like Memphis. So we're somewhere in the middle right here in Nashville. We're 7A. Some microclimates 7B, but pretty solid 7A. So there's a variance across Tennessee. Okay, so here's a nice visual map. I'm super visual, so hopefully this helps y'all. The map on the top are the counties in Tennessee, and you can see how it divides our climates. So here in the Central Basin, we kind of have the largest zone, and it just shows that we kind of have a certain amount of heat, a certain amount of rainfall in this area, and certain weather patterns. And if you categorize yourself in one of these zones, you might have a little bit different plant selection, some different kind of hardiness with certain plants. So yeah, they're divided by East Tennessee, Cumberland Plateau, Middle Tennessee, which is also called the Central Basin, and then West Tennessee, which is kind of like a coastal, Gulf coastal plain, as you can see on the bottom map. The bottom map is all geographic, so you can see the rivers running north to south, the plateau and the Smoky Mountains kind of running north to south, and this really affects our weather. Here in the basin, the weather tends to kind of hang out, so it'll slow going towards the east, and we'll kind of get extra precipitation in this basin just generally. So kind of a visual representation of Tennessee climate. Okay, so where are we? The Central Basin, Middle Tennessee, Nashville area. We're going to talk about that because that's what most of us need to know about. And if you're not from Tennessee, we're going to kind of help y'all out to see what to expect. We're between the coastal lowlands and the Cumberland Plateau, so we're kind of in a basin or a little bit of a bowl here. It's a depression, and like I said before, we tend to get weather storms sometimes. I'd say coagulating. They kind of will increase over us or slow down, and sometimes we'll get an increased rainfall versus further east. We tend to get a little bit lengthy warm seasons, so the heat tends to kind of sit and the humidity tends to kind of sit in our central basin here. 7A, that's pretty solid, our zone. Now, they've changed in the past, but 7A is where we sit. That just means we expect to reach maybe negative 15 in a winter. Negative 10 happens. Negative 15 is uncommon. But if we're putting landscape plants in the ground, we kind of want to plan for worst case scenarios. So negative 15, you'll see plant tags. with the hardiness zones, say, like down to negative 10 to negative 20. That's pretty typical. And then we'll touch on something that's less common. So the heat zone, that's the Horticultural Society that releases this. That actually tracks number of days above 86 degrees. So like heat tolerance, some plants just can't take the heat. We typically have more than a couple months on average with days above 86 degrees. Our growing season averages around 204 days. Of course, that changes from year to year. That's a little bit less than we get in Memphis as far as growing season. That's a pretty heavy crop area, Memphis and further west, but definitely a lot more days than when we go to East Tennessee, Knoxville, the Plateau, Johnson City. They're all going to have a lot shorter growing season. Usually we're talking about edible crops, so something that a agricultural farmer would grow, or for your cool season, warm season crops, that just kind of tells you how long can I harvest and grow for. Last frost, that's typically April 6th. You know, you hear a lot of different opinions on that, but that's just our average last frost date. That kind of tells us when we can start putting plants in the ground, especially tender perennials and vegetables. So that date is kind of our magical area for when we say we're safe to plant. Our winters tend to be mild. We haven't quite gotten into winter yet, but it's already a pretty mild winter. It'll tend to go up and down into the winter with a wet spring and fall. So we've had plenty of rainfall. We've got plenty coming up. And then hot, humid summers. Our summers can have drought. They can also have rain. So it just depends on the year. Typically, we'll get a little bit of a late summer drought with humidity all the way through. So there's just a general look at all the information for our Middle Tennessee climate. And here I've actually got the Hardiness Zone Map. So if anyone has like a plant book, typically you'll see the Hardiness Zone Map. And I've added the Plant Heat Zone Map. So that's, when we're talking about certain plants, that can be important. Especially our evergreens like spruces, which don't necessarily like all the heat, or cypresses, so we got to be a little bit careful. But these two maps are typically very similar, so the colder it gets in the winter, typically the colder it stays in the summer, and vice versa. You know, if we don't get that cold in the winter, our days above 86 degrees tend to be more. So we don't typically use both these maps, but it can be a tool. So again, 7A is a pretty solid bet here in Middle Tennessee. Okay, global climate. So I know we're talking about Middle Tennessee, but sometimes it's nice to look at other climates across the world because we get plants from all over the place. And if they grow plants and they have a similar climate, there's a good bet it's going to do well here. Hot and cold, rainfall patterns, those are all going to be similar in these places. And plants that are native or come from these areas tend to do well here. So, and we'll look at some of these plants on the table to kind of show that as an example. But the biggest one is Central China, or China in general. Central China is the closest to Middle Tennessee, apart from being in the United States. Similar amounts of rainfall, similar amounts of average temperatures. They tend to have fairly mild winters and humid summers. In fact, the soil types can be similar in China with a lot of clay content. And a lot of our plants in nursery production tend to come from China. Of course, you know, not necessarily the majority of them, but a lot of real common ones. So like hollies, people are familiar with. There's a whole chunk of hollies that come from Asia. Cryptomeria come from Asia. Vitex, crepe myrtle, that's a fairly popular one that tends to come from the Asian area. And they all do really well here. So there's a huge list of plants from Asia, but if you look at plants native to Asia, chances are you'll see them growing in Tennessee. Sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. I mean, we do get invasive honeysuckle that comes from Asia and various other invasive plants. We have some good-looking landscape plants that stay in their spots, so we'll talk about those. The other areas, the Middle East, Iran, Pakistan, Tajikistan, there's a whole list of them. They also have a similar climate, but a little bit drier. So In the drier parts of the state, we get a little more of that Middle Eastern climate. There's a lot less plants that, we can refer to from there, but a lot of perennials, things like pomegranate, things that like that dry climate. Rosemary is, from the Mediterranean. Those do fairly well here, and it's just something to think about. Is kind of like a sister climate in another part of the world. Okay, and what are we going to do with this? We got climate information. How does it help us in the landscape setting? It's going to tell us what plants are going to grow here. How hardy is that going to be? We can push certain plants, but we kind of need to know how far are we taking it out of its natural climate. Pretty much here, predict to have water concerns in the spring and fall. We tend to get these seasonal deluges of rainfall, so we can get a lot of rainfall in a short period of time. That's kind of our subtropic climate doing that. So water in the spring and fall can be something to look at, and where that water runs and looking at erosion and stuff like that is pretty important in Middle Tennessee. Growing season, harvest times, that's all going to be determined by our number of days, 204 average in Middle Tennessee, how long you have to grow your crops. And then, like we just touched on, similar climates will have similar plants, so you can kind of put your plant palette together based on where these things grow. There's a few things you can't really tell with climate, and maybe these are good ideas for another topic. Nutrition and soil issues, we can't really tell that through climate necessarily. So like clay content, how much nitrogen is available, we can't really determine that with climate. There are always extreme weather outliers. Whether that's become more common or not is definitely something that always gets debated, but we always get, extreme cold or hot or rain in Tennessee. We just tend to get these oddball things happening every year, so expect to be surprised occasionally. And take into consideration microclimates. If you live at the bottom of a gully near water, or if you live on the hilltop, your plant hardiness and how well they do may change a little bit, even if you are both in Middle Tennessee. So I mentioned urban space. If you live in the city, it's probably not going to get as cold in the winter because of the heat island effect. So look at where you live specifically, even in your zip code. Things can change a little bit. Okay, so that's all I have with just my boring old slides, and we'll talk about some plants on the table here. And so, yeah, if y'all have any questions, let us know. I did put a little plug. Most of my information came from ETSU, so in Johnson City. They have a climatology department, so that's a really good resource if y'all want to dig into this any further. So that's there. ETSU, great resource. I'll just kind of chat about some of these plants on the table. I started with, I got a couple plants out of our garden center. These are not hardy here through the winter. Philodendron, I really don't have one that grows anywhere near here. But, split leaf philodendron, most of us know as a tropical jungle plant. Here in Middle Tennessee, we have nothing really that looks like this. So this needs a full tropical, not subtropical climate, closer to the equator. You could grow them outside in the warm season, but in the winter, our climate is just not conducive to philodendron and jungle tropical plants. So, this is kind of a red flag. This type of look tells me it's just not going to take our cold. And then behind it, we actually have a yucca that's been trained onto like a stalk. But this is yucca. Now, this is not the yucca, and I'm not exactly sure which species this is. We do have yuccas in the landscape, and I've got one on the table I'll show you. This will not survive our winters. It would love our heat and our summers, but it is a greenhouse plant. Now, in comparison, I do have a native yucca. So these grow all across the United States. Native, the West Coast, the Midwest, the Southwest are really hot spots for yucca. These do fine here, and in fact, they can take the cold pretty well. You don't see them much further north, But, you know, this is Yucca filamentosa. It looks very similar to this tropical yucca. So we're just kind of looking at the same genus of plants. They're both yuccas. One is an indoor plant because of the climate that it prefers, and one is an outdoor plant. The thing with yuccas is they can all take pretty extreme heat. So even though this one can take more cold, they can both take the heat. So if we have a radiant wall, rock beds, yucca's an awesome choice. And it does kind of give you that desert effect. So if you like those desert climate plants, there are some that do live in the 7A hardiness zone. In fact, they can tolerate a much higher temperature as well. So, you know, this is where, looking at the climate across the United States, this fits a lot of bills, especially if you want like a desert landscape. But don't plant the ones in the garden center because it will not survive out here. I do also have a couple of grasses and a couple hollies. So,
Ben, I'm just going to jump in here and say, if you have questions, go ahead and ask them now.
Yeah.
And we'll get to them as we go through these plants.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've only got a few more. You know, we talked about China being kind of a sister climate to us. I've got a couple grasses. So on my left, right here, this one I'm shaking, this is switchgrass. So this is Northwind switchgrass, a Tennessee native. It's seen kind of a resurgence in the landscape for rain gardens and kind of these natural grass gardens. You know, this thing thrives here. It's native. It's a clumping grass. And then the one on the right, this is a grass indigenous to China. Both of these do really well here. But the maiden grass has a very different plume on it. So that's an identifying feature. Even though they can have similar uses and they survive in similar climates, they're two very different options that do well here. So, you know, if you want to go a full-on native garden, that's great. I think that's a good direction to go. You know, you've got a ton of switchgrasses, but if you're just looking for something maybe more like an oriental garden, or you're doing Japanese maples or oriental cypress, we have a grass from a similar climate to ours that does just as well. So now, like we said, there are species coming from other countries, and there are non-cultivated varieties that can become invasive. So you do need to shop with a little bit of knowledge and knowing that what you're buying is going to do what you want it to do, and it's going to stay put. Luckily, most of the newer varieties really do not reseed readily, but that is always something to be cautious of.
Okay, and we do have a question in now. Several years ago, a neighbor gave me a tiny yucca that I planted outside against the house. Early southern sun, fairly dry. It's very spiny, and it must be about 6 feet tall.
Sure.
I've noticed the lower leaves turn black, especially this time of year. So instead of one yucca, I must have 6 now. So 2 questions here. Can they be separated? And also, the tallest one has, quote unquote, fallen over, but I think it's still growing. Can I cut the trunk of the fallen one from the mother plant?
Sure. I'll actually use this little tropical one, even though this is not the one you probably have. Yeah, so yucca is a monocot, so it grows a lot like a grass, and they'll get tall. The downside of that is, even though they will grow tall and put new branches up, the bottom branches tend to shed and turn brown, and so they'll end up having a stalk the taller they get. Sometimes folks will cut them to keep them shorter, so keep cutting the tops so they don't grow tall. But you know, if yours is having brown, black leaves, it's really just trying to shed those older leaves. It's not a bad idea if you have brown, black leaves on a yucca. You may have to put some gloves on and remove those leaves from the bottom. It'll just make it look better. And it's really not doing anything for the plant. And it's a natural part of its life cycle. So they always shed as they grow on the bottom. If you're getting death in the top, that would be kind of different. But yeah, go ahead and take off those leaves that are hitting the ground or turning brown. And then they will pup off. So they will put, as they get mature, they'll put little babies around them, and they can even reseed. but if you have one that's kind of tilted over or pulled out of the ground, you could easily pull it out of the ground and move it. The biggest thing would be to probably stake it for about a year and really pack the soil when you transplant it, because they don't always have the toughest root system, and you want to help it out. And if you stabilize it, stand it up, move it, and keep it there for about a year, it shouldn't fall over anymore. So, yeah, I think that answers the question. But yeah, I mean, if you have babies, you can separate them. If you can get a sharp shovel in between them, you can separate them and move them around your garden. But if they're getting top heavy, you're going to need to support them. If it's in a real windy location, it may just keep falling over. But, stick a stake by it for a year and see what happens.
All right, and then we got another question. Well, first of all, Nancy's following up with what tool to use to cut off those lower yucca leaves. My clippers don't make a dent.
Yeah, the rough and ready example would be like a machete or something, which is something people in southern climates down in the tropics use a lot.
I have one for cutting down my banana trees.
Yeah, and I mean, we don't want to be cutting into the tree, but just even just like a chopping knife or something that you can use to kind of cut those leaves. They can be very tough. It's not going to hurt the plant if you don't remove them. It's just going to make it look better. So you maybe even be able to use like a tree saw gently. Yeah, just something sharp. I know they can be kind of succulent. You may even need to wait for dry weather to dry them out to make them easier to handle. But yeah, I mean, pruners, if those don't work, you could try, like I said, like a machete or something that you can use to chop them. Yeah, whatever method you can find. I mean, yuccas are fairly resilient, so I wouldn't worry about hurting the plant. Yeah.
All right, and another question, is this a good time to plant switchgrass?
It is. We usually recommend fall planting for most things. I will say grasses don't really like a lot of our fall moisture. So it's not a bad idea to prioritize grasses in the summer. Grasses, for the most part, really like growing in the summertime. And when you're planting them right now, you're going to be planting some brown grasses, so you're going to have to wait till spring to see how well they've overwintered. So it's not a bad time to plant. Sometimes it can show a little more success in the summertime. So not to dissuade you, but if you're really looking for the best time for grasses, it's one of the few that really likes a summertime planting. Yeah. Was there that was the first question, right?
That was a question that was asked.
Okay.
Yeah, in the middle of the other one. So
yeah.
you can continue.
Yeah, keep them coming. Let me know. But yeah, the last thing I have are 2 hollies. Most everyone knows what a holly is. But I've got a Chinese holly, also known as the species cornuta. And then I've got a native holly. So this is off of Ilex opaca, so Cedar Hill, but this is kind of a ground cover variety. This plant is very ubiquitous, very common in the landscape. It's called Carissa holly. Super pokey. This is probably one of the older cornuta varieties we get, the Asian holly. Does great here. You see it everywhere. And just the similarity even to our native holly. Now, this is a Maryland Beauty, a lower version. But they have a very similar use and somewhat similar of a texture and color. These both like the exact same climates. They just happen to grow or be from places on the other side of the globe. So this just is going back to reiterate that plants in similar climates are probably going to do well in the same place. So, Asian Oriental gardens are a pretty good, safe bet in Middle Tennessee. And so are, the native gardens. So, just to show you that you have a really wide palette, plants from China are extremely common once you start digging into it. And they all do fairly well here. So, yeah, 2 different hollies. One from, right here in the U.S. and one all the way from China, and really very, very similar looks, even though they're totally different species. So.